Hey guys, it's Chris here, and this is my review video of the Tentbox Lite XL Living Pod. Well, here it is, my living pod review for the Tentbox Lite XL. While I will be talking about my XL living pod in this video, I want you to remember that the Lite XL and the Lite 2.0 living pods are identical apart from their size, so 99% of what I say about the XL in this video is relevant for the Lite 2.0 living pod as well. For those of you following my channel for a while, I must first apologise that this video has taken me so long to produce. When my living pod finally arrived last year, I went straight into a busy summer photographing weddings. Then I had a combination of holidays, illness and just generally awful weather, which made it very difficult to go out and film. The wait is finally over, and I've managed to use my living pod 5 or 6 times now, which gives me a better understanding of what this Tentbox accessory is about, along with my pros and cons. I decided to film this video in 2 locations over 2 separate campouts, so I'll be interchanging footage from both. Splitting the filming ended up being a good idea because the weather conditions were so different on both days. The first day was very windy, and the second day was very rainy, so it was great for testing and putting it through its paces. The question you'll all be wondering is, what do I think? Do I love it? Well, we'll get to that shortly, don't worry. For those of you who have watched my XL review videos on this channel, you'll know that one of the main reasons I changed from my cargo to the Lite XL last year was because of the living pod. I wanted that enclosed space to cook, relax and go to the toilet in the middle of the night while it was raining. But how did it hold up once I started using it? Well, I'm pleased to say that over the winter, I was able to experience both heavy wind and rain while using the living pod, and I'll elaborate on my findings in a moment. For now, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel to receive more of my content. So for those of you new to tent boxing, the living pod is essentially an additional product which attaches to your tent box. It doesn't come with the tent, you have to order it separately. And it basically attaches to the side of your tent and essentially creates a self-contained room with your ladder inside. It also comes with a ground sheet, which I don't have installed in this video. The idea is that it gives you shelter and privacy in an enclosed space under your tent. The living pods are currently available for the Lite 2.0 and the Lite XL, and this summer they'll be launching the living pods for the Classic 2.0 and the Cargo 2.0. For each model of tent, there are 2 sizes of living pod, a standard and a taller version, which covers all heights of vehicles, so you just need to be sure to pick the correct height of pod for the height of your vehicle. More details are on the Tentbox website. The living pods, at least at the moment, are not backwards compatible with the Lite, Classic and Cargo 1.0 models. I'll talk about this more later. For those of you wondering about the difference between the living pod and the side awning, I'm currently producing a separate video which will compare the living pod against the side awning and the new awning tunnels, which have also been released recently. That will be available very soon on my channel. I'll also be producing dedicated review videos for the new Classic and Cargo tents this summer, and those videos will include either the living pods or the awning tunnels for those tents. For this video, I'm just going to focus on the Lite living pods. To start off with, I decided not to include in-depth footage of me setting up the living pod in this video to save some time. Tentbox have made a great installation video on their website which you can check out, so I didn't feel a need to replicate that. What I will say is that the process of setting up the living pod strikes a fine balance between being a little bit faffy but not too much trouble. If setting up the tent by itself takes 5 minutes, the living pod adds an additional 10 minutes of setup time. The first time I set it up on my own was in the wind and I managed absolutely fine. Once you get everything in place, you simply start pegging down the base and attaching the guy ropes. I've read a few people say online that the base panels could have done with some more anchor points to stop water ingress. I do agree with this, particularly on the front panel, as I found the front panel was also lifting in the wind. You can see here how easily it lifts. It's not a major issue and I don't expect the living pod to be completely watertight, but I saw another tent boxer come up with a great solution. They installed eyelet holes along the base edge using an eyelet punch tool, and I feel that would be a great solution and something Tentbox should definitely consider if they're ever going to do a second iteration of this living pod. The first time I used the living pod, it was a really windy night. The living pod held up well and I didn't feel like it was going to break or detach from the tent, but I did want to feed back a few pointers. These guy ropes that you can see here are absolutely key. On my first night, when I used it in the wind, I forgot to attach the guy ropes, and a big gust of wind would cause the living pod to cave in on itself around the window area. It would return to position by itself, but I found that the guy ropes really help keep the living pod in place and keep its structure intact. Secondly, in the wind, the living pod suffers from the same problem as any large canvas panel, which includes the universal awning room. When the wind hits a closed panel, it really causes the panel to cave in, as you can see here. If you keep your living pod packed with camping equipment, it's entirely possible that on a windy day, the wind and the walls buckling in could cause some things to get knocked over. It also makes a hell of a noise when the wind gets hold of it. It is what it is, it's not a criticism, but just be mindful of that. The third thing I found is that when it was really windy, the hooks at the top of the living pod kept detaching from the loops on the tent. I ended up using some carabiner clips to keep it in place. It's not an issue when it's not windy, and it wouldn't have caused the living pod to detach in any way, but something I wanted to mention. Maybe on the next iteration of the living pod, instead of hooks to connect at the top, they could use a different connector that would keep the hooks attached to the loops. I said earlier that I bought my XL in the hope that the living pod would give me that enclosed space for that midnight toilet run. Back in 2020, we were wild camping in the Cairngorms, and in the middle of the night, I got absolutely soaked with rain when I headed outside for a midnight pee break. The living pod would theoretically give me that cover on a rainy night, so I decided to set up my porta potty in the corner of the living pod to see how I got on. Sure enough, at 2 AM when it was lashing down with rain, I went down the ladder to find a dry, enclosed space, and I was able to do my business and stay dry the whole time. It worked exactly as I hoped it would. Result. In terms of internal size, you're probably looking at about 3 meters wide and about 2.5 meters depth of usable space inside the living pod. The width may be less on the Lite 2.0, given that the 2.0 tent is not as wide. You definitely have plenty of room to cook, as well as sit and relax with a table and chairs inside the living pod. One big criticism of the living pod is that when it's closed up and all the panels are down, it can be very dark inside. The solution in that situation is to use one of these. It's called a Lite. Most of you have probably seen one before. This is a small one that came in a pack of 4 from Lidl, literally rechargeable. I just click the little button on the front and the bottom. We just set them up around the living pod, and that basically allows us to add more light into the living pod. I'm kind of saying this jokingly, but that's how you solve the problem. I don't know why people are complaining online about the fact that it's too dark. Add some light into it. It's the same could be said inside the tent. When all the windows and stuff are shut, you're like, oh, it's too dark in there. Well, add lights. That's what we do, whether it's fairy lights, festoon lights, there's loads of different ways you can do it. But that's how you solve the problem of the living pod being too dark. Yes, you can use a pack of camping lights to make a darker space lighter, but remember that the living pod can also be configured with the panels up using the included telescopic poles. This in turn would let more light in. I do agree that a window on one of the side panels would have helped let more light in, but you have to consider privacy. Although an additional zip panel to cover that window would have solved this issue. Again, maybe on the next iteration, but the truth is that it's absolutely fine. So, when would you need a living pod? Well, in my opinion, I don't believe a living pod is the best solution for people who are doing single nights away, especially if you're on a road trip and you're arriving late and leaving early the next morning. This is because of the extra setup time needed for the living pod. I'm just not convinced it's worth it for a one-night stay, unless you're going to be making a good run of it where you're arriving earlier and leaving a little bit later. It's a better solution if you're setting up for a couple of days or more in one place, such as a campsite. While I'm talking about setting up and packing down, it's also worth mentioning that the living pod has a lovely oversized bag, so there's no issues packing it away. I hate when a camping product comes in a tiny bag. There's nothing worse, so I'm pleased to say that it's not a problem here, and it also comes with 2 clips and a carry handle to tighten the bag, and it makes it easy to carry and pack away. What I also like about the living pod is that I feel if you wanted to leave your tent and have a wander off, it would provide an element of extra protection, as no one is likely to go looking inside your living pod when it's closed up. There's no guarantees, of course, but I feel it would offer you a little more protection, theoretically, from a chance of thief or a nosy person to stop anyone coming and having a look inside your tent. To save time on this video, I thought I'd sum up my pros and cons. So here are a few things that I love about the living pod. It's got a relatively quick setup time, about 10 minutes max, which yes, does add on to things, but I think it's worth it. It also offers protection from the weather, and remember, not just from the rain and wind, but also from the sun as well. If you're someone who doesn't like sitting out in the sun and you prefer hiding in the shade, it does provide you with that bit of extra protection. It also provides an enclosed space, which means if you do want to come down in the middle of the night and use the toilet, you can do. If you want to cook, you can do. If you want to just sit and have some privacy, you're able to do that inside the living pod. It has an oversized bag, which I've mentioned, which makes it easy to pack away. The panels also open up to make a bigger space and add more daylight in. I've also found it to be very strong as well, and it survived the heavy winds when I was using it for the first time. And while nothing can ever be waterproof, I did find on my second night it did a very good job of keeping the rain out, and I came down in the middle of the night and there was no rain at all inside the living pod. Now, if you're asking yourself if there's any negatives, I think it entirely depends on your point of view, but here are some considerations. It does need extra time to set up. So if you're wanting to just pop up the tent and get cracking, it doesn't allow you to do that. It does add that extra 10 minutes of setup time and also the extra time to pack down as well. So that needs to be considered depending potentially on your style of traveling. As I've mentioned in the wind, the big canvas panels do catch the wind and make a racket on a windy night. They also do buckle in as well, as you can see here. But this is the same whether you've got the universal awning room or any other large canvas material such as a drive-away awning or something like that. We've all seen an awning that didn't survive the heavy wind. Now, what I would say is this living pod did survive the heavy wind, but you do have to consider that they are large panels and they will bend a little bit in the wind. I do feel that it could do with some extra fixing points on the bottom part of the canvas. So, I think some extra eyelet holes along the bottom of the canvas to peg down would have been a great addition, and I mentioned before, it could be something that Tentbox could include in the next iteration of the living pod if they ever decided to do one. I mentioned before about it being dark inside, which is one of the heaviest criticisms it receives. Yes, it is a bit dark inside, and I do feel that a window on the side would have helped. But, like I said before, you don't want to sacrifice privacy. However, I do feel that a window with an optional panel behind it to zip up would have solved that problem and made a really good addition. So again, maybe something that Tentbox could consider in the future. The next criticism I had was about the top hooks. Now, these are the hooks that I mentioned earlier that connect the top of the living pod to the inside of the tent box. They were coming undone in the wind, and I ended up having to use carabiner clips, like I mentioned earlier, to keep it in place. So I do feel a different type of hook that would allow it to stay in place would work. There is one more criticism that I don't personally have, but some people would have, and that depends entirely on your style of camping while you're away. And that is that when you have the living pod attached to your tent, you can't just drive your car away if, for example, you were stopping at a campsite and wanted to use your car during the day. Now, if you had your tent box open anyway, you still couldn't drive your car off if, like when you're comparing it to like a ground tent, for example, you could leave the ground tent in position and just drive your car off throughout the day. With a tent box, you can't do that, but you could fold your tent box away and then drive off. Now, obviously, with the living pod attached, it further adds to that idea that it's more difficult to be able to just pack things away because things would take much longer to pack away with the living pod. So you just need to consider that if you are going to go away camping, what would you like to do with your vehicle during the day? Now, if you're like us and you're happy just sitting at a campsite all day and you don't need to use your vehicle, then the living pod's absolutely fine. But if you feel that you might need to drive your vehicle around while you're away camping, then the living pod might potentially not be the best option for you. But again, just consider how you might want to travel and how you might want to camp, and just bear that in mind. One big criticism among many of the Tentbox crowd has been that the living pods are not compatible with the previous iterations of the tents. I see a lot of comments online such as "we've been forgotten about," or "they don't care about us anymore," or "Tentbox are just focusing on new people." Well, there is a simple reason that the living pods are not backwards compatible with the previous models of the tents, and that's because those tents were not designed with the living pods in mind. Some of those tent designs are over 4 or 5 years old, so it's not a case of the Tentbox don't care about you, it's simply a case that the living pods don't fit those tents. I did speak to Tentbox about whether they were trying to create a backwards compatibility kit, and they said that they tried many times but unfortunately couldn't create a solution that they felt the quality was up to standard. Releasing a backwards compatibility kit, which essentially wouldn't be up to product standards and wouldn't do a very good job, would in itself open itself up to criticism. Tentbox have found themselves receiving a lot of criticism about this, and ultimately it's one of those damned if you do, damned if you don't situations. But I just wanted to address this in case you find yourself in that situation and you were thinking that you've been left behind. So the only other thing I've not mentioned is about the price of the living pod. Now, I'm not going to talk about specific pricing in this video because that could change in the future. But what I do want to mention is the price of the living pod compared to other options that are available on the market. Now, I've already mentioned about the living pod being comparable to something like a drive-away awning, for example. Now, a drive-away awning is much cheaper than what it would be to buy the living pod. But that's not to say that one solution is better or worse than the other. They're just very different. But what I would say is simply that the Living Pod is an excellent bit of kit, and I feel it is well worth the money. So guys, that's it from me. That's my XL Living Pod review video. Now, I hope you found this video helpful. Hopefully, like all my other videos, it's been informative. I have left a few things out, like I said earlier. I didn't include the installation of the Living Pod just because Tentbox have done their own video on that. You can go and check that out if you want to know how to install the Living Pod on your tent. But I wanted to cover kind of the essentials and the basics, and also do like almost like a catch-up review. And like I said earlier, you know, in my XL review video, which I did last year, I talked about why I wanted to get the Living Pod. And in this video, I wanted to kind of say, you know, I have it now. It's served its purpose. It's doing exactly what I hoped it would do. And I'm pleased to say that it is. But yeah, it looks great. I'm really, really happy with it. It took a little bit to get used to setting it up. This is probably the 5th time I've used it. And it took a little bit to getting everything tightened properly and getting it set up in a certain way. But last night, it did a really good job. Everything stayed intact. And yeah, I love it. I think it's great. So that's it from me. I'm going to go. Just remember, if you're deciding to order a Tentbox tent for yourself, you can head to the link in the description for this video and grab yourself a discount. It's always there. Any questions, just pop them in the comments or send us a message on the Choc Chip Travels Instagram account. I will get back to you. But yeah, that's it from me. Have a day, and I'll speak to you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.